Jake had always been an early riser. It wasn't something he planned. It was just how things had always worked out. His day began before the sun fully rose, the world still sleepy and quiet. For Jake, the early hours of the day were his favorite time. He would wake up, grab a cup of coffee, and get to work. It was his time to focus, to get things done without the usual distractions. His lawn was always a point of pride for him. He loved keeping his yard neat and clean, a little patch of green that added to the charm of his home. He would step out into his front yard, mower in hand, to take care of it before the heat of the day set in. It wasn't that he had to do it early. It was just when he felt it was most convenient for him. And it worked. He didn't have to worry about the sun beating down on him. He didn't have to deal with the neighbors being around. It was peaceful. This morning, as Jake fired up his lawnmower at precisely 6 a.m., everything seemed normal. The lawnmower roared to life, and he began to make his way down the first row of grass. The scent of fresh-cut grass filled the air, and for a moment, Jake thought about how simple and routine his life had been, until he noticed something strange. Standing in her front yard, across the street, was his neighbor, Karen. She was staring at him intently, her arms crossed, a sour expression on her face. He didn't think much of it at first. He knew Karen was a stickler for the rules, especially when it came to the neighborhood HOA. She was the president, after all, and she often looked for opportunities to point out what others were doing wrong. It wasn't unusual for Karen to keep an eye on things. But this morning felt different. As Jake continued mowing, he caught glimpses of Karen still standing there, not moving, just watching him. He felt a little uneasy under her gaze, but he shook it off. It was just Karen being Karen. Little did he know, this would be the start of something far worse. Jake finished the front lawn, took a sip of his coffee, and looked at his watch. It was a little after 6:30 a.m. now. He'd be done soon, and then he could enjoy the rest of his day. He had no idea that, just a few minutes later, everything was about to change. He had barely made it to the backyard when he heard the sound of sirens in the distance. At first, Jake didn't think much of it. Sirens were a common sound in the neighborhood. But then they got closer. And closer. The sound of the sirens grew louder, and before he knew it, a police car had pulled into his driveway. Jake stopped the mower, confused. The officer got out of the car and walked toward him. "Morning, sir," the officer said, his tone polite but firm. "Is everything okay here?" Jake furrowed his brow, still not understanding what was happening. "Yeah, everything's fine. I'm just mowing my lawn. What's the problem?" The officer's expression was unreadable as he spoke. "We received a 911 call. A noise complaint was filed. Someone in the neighborhood said you were disturbing the peace by mowing your lawn too early." Jake's blood began to boil. He glanced over at Karen's house, and there she was, still standing in her front yard, watching him, her arms still crossed. His mind raced as the officer continued to speak. "We just wanted to make sure everything was okay. We can't ignore noise complaints, even if they seem a little out of hand. But as long as you're following the rules, there's no problem." Jake was furious now. He couldn't believe it. Karen had called the cops on him because he was mowing his lawn. At 6 a.m. It wasn't even that early, and it was within the time allowed for outdoor noise. But somehow, Karen had turned a simple task into a problem. She had found a way to complain about something that shouldn't even have been an issue. Jake clenched his fists, but he stayed calm. He knew getting angry wasn't going to help. "I'm following the rules. It's 6 a.m. I've been mowing my lawn at this time for years. There's no law against it." The officer nodded. "We're not here to escalate things, just to make sure everything's in order. But you should know that if Karen keeps filing complaints, it could lead to more issues down the line. Just something to be aware of." Jake was speechless. He couldn't believe this was happening. He had been doing the same thing for years, but now it was a problem. "I'll keep that in mind," Jake said, still trying to keep his temper in check. "Thanks for letting me know." The officer gave a short nod and turned to leave, but as he walked away, Jake heard Karen's voice in the background. "That's right. Someone has to keep things in line around here. Karen called out from her yard. Jake could hear the smugness in her voice. He knew she was behind this. This wasn't just a random complaint. This was Karen using her position in the HOA to try to control him, to make him follow her arbitrary rules. Jake felt a surge of frustration and anger. He wasn't going to let this slide. He wasn't going to let Karen dictate how he lived his life. But he also knew that this wasn't just about the lawn mowing. This was about power. Karen had always used her role as HOA president to push people around, to make them bend to her will. And now, she was using the HOA to make Jake's life miserable. Jake wasn't going to let her get away with it. He wasn't going to back down, but he needed to think. This wasn't just a small issue anymore. It was a matter of principle. Karen had crossed a line, and Jake wasn't going to let her get away with it. As he finished mowing the lawn, his thoughts began to race. He had to figure out what to do next. He couldn't let Karen control him, couldn't let her think she had the upper hand. He was done with her games. Jake walked back into the house, still seething, but he was already plotting his next move. He wasn't going to let Karen make him feel small. It was time to take control, and he had a plan. Jake was still simmering as he walked back inside his house. The officer had left, and Karen had no doubt made her little victory speech to herself, thinking she'd put Jake in his place. But Jake wasn't about to let her win. He had never been one to back down, but now more than ever, he realized he was dealing with a much bigger problem than just an overzealous neighbor. The HOA, Karen's petty complaints, and her ability to use her position as a weapon were all tactics she had used countless times before. But Jake wasn't going to let it slide. He wasn't going to let her turn his life into a battleground where she always came out on top. The more he thought about it, the angrier he got. Mowing his lawn at 6 a.m. wasn't a crime, and it certainly wasn't something that should have led to a police call. It was just a man taking care of his property. But to Karen, it was another opportunity to control someone, to make someone feel like they weren't allowed to live their life without her approval. He knew this was just the beginning. He had to be ready. Jake walked into his kitchen, his hands trembling slightly as he poured himself a glass of water. He could still hear Karen's voice in his head, echoing with that smug tone, the way she had acted like she had the power to dictate every aspect of his life. It was more than just irritating. It was infuriating. Jake knew that Karen had been using her role as HOA president for far too long to bully people, to make them bend to her will. He had seen it happen time and time again. Neighbors who were too afraid to stand up to her, too intimidated by her position to fight back. But Jake wasn't going to be one of those people. He was done with her thinking she could control him. And as the anger settled into determination, Jake realized he had to do something about it. He couldn't let her just keep crossing boundaries, not when he was the one getting hurt. The thought of what Karen had done to him, it was more than just an annoying complaint. It was a power play. And Jake wasn't about to let her win. He needed to make sure she knew she couldn't just do whatever she wanted. He needed to make sure Karen understood that there were consequences to her actions. The idea hit him out of nowhere. What if he could use her tactics against her? What if he could make her feel the same frustration, the same helplessness that she had put him through? For the first time that morning, Jake smiled to himself. If Karen thought she could call the shots, he'd show her how it felt to be at the mercy of someone else's decisions. He had a few ideas. It wasn't going to be anything drastic. No, Jake wasn't the type to cause unnecessary chaos. But he knew Karen, and he knew her weaknesses. And right now, her biggest weakness was her need to feel in control. Jake took a deep breath, feeling the anger and frustration start to fade into something else, something sharper. It was time to turn the tables. He wouldn't just let her sit on her high horse and get away with everything. He wasn't going to make things easy for her. He was going to force her to realize that no one was above the rules, not even the HOA president. But he had to play it smart. He needed to make sure Karen felt the discomfort, the frustration, the sheer annoyance of being powerless. That was the only way to get through to someone like her. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about fighting fire with fire. It was about teaching her a lesson in respect. Jake's mind began to race as he thought about the little ways he could turn the tables. He had to be patient. He couldn't react impulsively. This wasn't about confrontation. It was about strategy. And Jake was damn good at strategy. The first step was simple. He needed to get Karen's attention, but he couldn't do it by just showing up at her door. That would play into her game. No, he needed to do something that would force her to come to him. Something she wouldn't expect. The trash day. Jake had always hated how loud and disruptive it was. But for some reason, Karen always seemed to complain about it. She hated the noise. The trucks coming in early in the morning. It drove her crazy. And that's when it hit Jake. What if he used that? What if, instead of making his lawnmower his weapon of choice, he used the trash trucks to turn Karen's mornings into a nightmare? The idea was simple, but brilliant. Jake could make sure the trash was out earlier than usual, every single week. He'd make sure the trucks would arrive before dawn, and each time they did, Karen would be forced to deal with the noise. Every single week. He grinned to himself. It was perfect. It wasn't against the rules. It wasn't illegal. It was just a little adjustment to his own schedule, something small that would make a huge impact on Karen. Karen would get a taste of what it was like to feel helpless, to have something beyond her control ruin her morning. It was poetic, in a way. And it was just the beginning. The next day, Jake started implementing his plan. He woke up early, well before sunrise, and made sure the trash bins were out on the curb. He wasn't just putting them out at a reasonable time. No, he made sure it was a few minutes earlier than the usual routine. As the hours passed, Jake could barely contain his excitement. The trash trucks came as usual, but this time, they were a little earlier, rumbling down the street with a deafening roar. Jake could hear the noise from his house, and he knew Karen could hear it too. She wouldn't be able to ignore it. And for the first time in a long while, Jake felt something other than frustration. He felt control. The feeling was almost intoxicating. This wasn't just about getting back at Karen. This was about showing her that no one, could make his life miserable without facing the consequences. He smiled to himself as the trash truck rumbled past his house, knowing full well that Karen was going to wake up to a rude awakening. He had taken the first step in his quiet rebellion, and it felt good. Jake had expected some pushback, but Karen's reaction was far more intense than he anticipated. He'd been on edge, listening for signs of her growing frustration, but the next few days brought a different kind of tension. Every morning, just before the sun rose, Jake made sure the trash bins were at the curb. He could hear the trucks coming down the street, the rumble of their engines louder than usual, and each time they stopped in front of Karen's house, he could almost picture her fuming behind closed windows. But Jake wasn't in a rush. His actions were slow, deliberate, and calculated. He had learned over time that sometimes, patience was the best weapon, especially when it came to someone like Karen. He knew she'd be upset. The trash trucks came earlier than usual, and the noise was jarring. There was no way she could sleep through it. And that was the whole point. The first day, Jake heard her shout something from across the street, probably cursing under her breath, but he stayed quiet, acting as if he hadn't heard a thing. The second day, the same. Trash day came, and Jake could hear the trucks grinding gears echoing through the street as they stopped in front of Karen's house. She was awake now, but she didn't dare confront him yet. He could feel her seething, knowing that she was being forced to face the consequences of her previous actions. But by the third day, Karen had had enough. Jake heard a knock on his door as he sat in the living room, drinking his coffee and enjoying the quiet morning. He glanced at the clock. It was still early, 7:15 a.m. Whoever it was, they were up far too early for a casual visit. Jake stood up, feeling a slight rush of excitement as he walked to the door. When he opened it, there stood Karen, her face twisted in anger. She hadn't bothered to knock with any semblance of politeness. She was fuming. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at Jake, her voice rising. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped. "You've been disrupting the peace of this neighborhood for days now. I'm trying to sleep, and I can't get a single moment of peace because of your ridiculous trash routine." Jake stood still, his expression calm. He wasn't going to let her intimidate him. "I'm sorry, Karen," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "But it's just trash day. I'm not sure what you're complaining about." The trucks are doing their job. This is outrageous, she shot back, clearly losing patience. You're deliberately messing with me. First, you mow your lawn at 6 a.m., and now this? You're trying to make my life miserable. You think you can just do whatever you want. Jake crossed his arms, the calmness in his voice unwavering. I'm just following the rules, Karen. I'm not doing anything wrong. The trash bins have to be out by a certain time, and I put them out when I always do. That's not the point. Karen's voice was practically shaking now. You've been doing this on purpose. You've been intentionally making noise to irritate me. Jake shook his head, letting out a small, controlled laugh. Karen, I didn't realize you were the only person who was allowed to have peace in this neighborhood. If I'm waking you up, that's not my intention. I'm just doing what needs to be done. Karen's face flushed bright red as she took a step toward him, leaning in close. You're testing me, Jake, she hissed, her voice low and dangerous. I can make sure you pay for this. I run the HOA, and I know exactly how to get back at you. You'll regret this. Her words hung in the air like a threat, but Jake didn't flinch. He stood his ground, knowing that what Karen didn't understand was that her threats didn't scare him. She had underestimated him. She thought she could use the HOA to make people's lives miserable, but she wasn't used to someone standing up to her. Go ahead, Karen, Jake said with a calm smile. Do what you need to do. But just know this, you don't control me. I'm not afraid of your threats anymore. You've been bullying people for too long, and it's time someone put a stop to it. Karen took a step back, her fists clenching in anger, but she didn't say another word. Without another word, she stormed off, leaving Jake standing at the door. He didn't feel fear or guilt. No, he felt something else. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Control. It felt good. As Karen marched back to her house, Jake knew this wouldn't be the last confrontation. But he also knew that it didn't matter. She was losing her grip. And soon enough, she'd realize she couldn't get away with her bullying tactics. The next morning, Jake made sure the trash bins were out earlier than usual, just to drive the point home. It wasn't about getting back at her. It was about taking a stand. The more he watched Karen struggle with the early morning disruptions, the more he realized that he wasn't the one being unreasonable. She was. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't breaking any rules. And that made all the difference. He had taken the first step, and now, he was going to make sure she felt the full weight of what it was like to be on the receiving end of her own brand of control. Jake wasn't going to back down. The quiet, controlled sense of satisfaction that filled him every time the trash trucks rumbled down the street was enough to tell him that he was on the right path. He wasn't just playing by the rules anymore. He was making sure Karen learned a lesson she'd never forget. Jake had expected Karen to fight back, but the intensity of her reaction shocked him. After their brief confrontation at his door, he hadn't heard from her for a couple of days. He thought maybe she was laying low, licking her wounds after her failed attempt to intimidate him. But then, as the next trash day rolled around, Jake received an unexpected visitor. It was a Saturday morning, still early, and Jake had just finished his coffee when he heard a knock at the door. He wasn't surprised to find Karen standing there, her arms crossed, her lips tightly pursed in that familiar, smug expression. "We need to talk," she said, her voice icy and calculated. Jake's first instinct was to shut the door and ignore her, but he wasn't about to let her walk all over him again. He wasn't intimidated. "What's going on, Karen?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. "I'm getting tired of this, Jake," she spat, her eyes narrowing. "You think you can just make my life miserable with your little trash day prank? You think you can walk all over the rules just because you feel like it? You've made a big mistake." Jake raised an eyebrow, leaning against the doorframe. "Oh? And what's that?" "You've crossed the line," Karen said, stepping forward, her tone low and threatening. "I've put up with your antics long enough, but this time, I'm not going to let it slide. I'm taking this to the HOA. I'm making sure they know what you're doing, and I'm going to make sure you pay for this." Jake's lips curled into a slight smile. He knew this was coming, and part of him enjoyed seeing Karen's arrogance start to falter. You're welcome to try, Jake said calmly, his voice steady. But you can't control everything, Karen. Not anymore. You don't own this neighborhood, and you're not going to bully me into submission. Karen's face turned bright red with fury. You think I'm just going to sit back and let you do this? She growled. I run this neighborhood. And if I say it's too early to put out trash, then that's the rule. You'll be hearing from the HOA, and I'll make sure they take care of this. Jake stood firm, refusing to be rattled by her threats. Go ahead. I'm not worried. You can't use the HOA to control people's lives, Karen. Not anymore. I'm tired of being pushed around by you and your petty rules. Karen seethed, but she didn't say anything more. She turned on her heel and stormed off, her face red with rage. Jake stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her walk away. He knew Karen wasn't done, but he didn't care. He had made his point. She couldn't intimidate him. Not anymore. The next day, Jake received an email from the HOA. As he opened it, he couldn't help but let out a small laugh. The subject line read, Noise complaint and trash day disruption. It was from Karen, of course. In her email, she detailed how Jake's actions were disrupting the peace of the neighborhood and violating HOA guidelines. She accused him of causing unnecessary noise by putting his trash bins out too early and mowing his lawn at inconvenient times. The email even included a list of her grievances, complete with times and dates of each alleged incident. Jake read through it with an amused smile. The complaints were laughable. None of them held any weight. There was nothing in the HOA's rules that prohibited people from putting out trash at a certain time, and Karen had twisted the facts to fit her narrative. She was trying to manipulate the HOA into taking her side, but Jake wasn't going to let it happen. He immediately drafted a response. He explained his side of the situation, that he had been following the rules, that the trash bins had been put out at a reasonable hour, and that Karen was simply making mountains out of molehills to get back at him. He attached evidence, including timestamps from his security cameras showing that he had put the bins out at a reasonable time, well within the rules. He also included a screenshot of his lawnmower's time log, showing that he had mowed his lawn within the hours allowed by the city. When Jake finished his response, he hit send, feeling a sense of satisfaction. He had all the evidence he needed. If Karen wanted to escalate this, she was going to have to deal with the facts. But Jake knew this wouldn't be the end of it. Karen wasn't going to take losing easily. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. Karen didn't come to his door, and there were no new emails from the HOA. Jake knew she was planning her next move. He didn't know what it would be, but he was ready. Then, on Tuesday afternoon, he got a knock on the door again. This time, it wasn't Karen. It was a neighbor, Steve, who lived 2 houses down. Steve had always been a quiet guy, keeping to himself, so when he showed up at Jake's door, Jake was a little surprised. Hey, Jake, Steve said, his face a bit uncomfortable. I just wanted to check in on you. Karen's been talking to everyone about what's been going on with the trash bins and the lawn mowing. She's really upset, and I just wanted to make sure you're not causing any more trouble. Jake blinked, trying to understand what Steve was saying. What do you mean causing trouble? He asked. Steve shifted uncomfortably, looking over his shoulder. Well, Karen's been saying you're intentionally making noise and trying to bother her. She's told the HOA you're breaking the rules, and she's really pushing for something to be done about it. Jake's blood began to boil. Of course Karen was talking to the neighbors, trying to rally support. She wanted to make him look like the villain. Listen, Steve, Jake said calmly, stepping outside and closing the door behind him. I've been following the rules. I've sent the HOA all the proof they need. This isn't about rules or noise. It's about Karen trying to control me. And it's not going to work. She can't manipulate me anymore. Steve nodded, looking somewhat relieved. I get it. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. Karen can be a lot sometimes. Thanks for checking in, Jake said. But I'm fine. I'm not going to let her push me around anymore. Steve gave a small nod, his eyes scanning the street as he backed away. Well, just keep it cool, okay? We don't need any more drama around here. Jake nodded, watching Steve walk back to his house. Once again, Karen's influence was beginning to spread through the neighborhood. She was trying to get everyone on her side, trying to make Jake the villain. But he wasn't going to let her win. Jake wasn't just defending his right to mow his lawn or put out his trash. He was defending his dignity. And he wasn't about to let Karen or anyone else take that from him. Jake's phone buzzed again. But this time, it wasn't an email from the HOA. It was a text from his neighbor, Mike. He read the message, and his stomach sank. Jake, Karen is really going all in on this. She's told a few neighbors you're breaking the rules with your lawn care and trash days. She's threatening to go to the city council about you. Mike's text rattled around in Jake's head. The city council? This was getting out of hand. Jake had been expecting something like this. Karen was known for using her influence to push her own agenda. But this time, she was pulling out all the stops. She wasn't just targeting him. She was trying to turn the entire neighborhood against him. It was clear now, Karen wasn't just angry. She was out for revenge. She didn't care about the rules or any sense of fairness. She wanted to be the one in control, and if she had to ruin Jake's life to do that, then so be it. The thought of her using her position to manipulate the whole neighborhood made Jake feel a sense of deep frustration. But at the same time, a plan was starting to form in his mind. Karen had made one fatal mistake. She had underestimated him. She had always thought she could control everything. But Jake was about to show her that he wasn't someone to be pushed around. As he paced back and forth, Jake's mind raced. He wasn't about to let Karen ruin his life. Not when he knew she was wrong. He had already documented everything, his lawn care records, the trash pickup times, and his interactions with the HOA. He had proof on his side. But he needed to do more than just defend himself. He needed to make Karen feel what it was like to be on the receiving end of her own power games. Jake had no intention of going down without a fight, and the more he thought about it, the more determined he became. It was time to hit Karen where it hurt the most, her reputation. The HOA and the city council could be manipulated, but the rest of the neighborhood? They wouldn't be so easily swayed. If he could expose Karen's true nature, he would make sure she would never again use her position to manipulate others. His plan was simple. Jake would start by talking to his neighbors, one by one, and telling them the truth. He would show them how Karen had abused her power as the HOA president, making false complaints and causing unnecessary trouble for everyone. It wasn't about attacking her. It was about showing everyone the truth. The real truth. Jake didn't want to be the bad guy. He didn't want to drag the whole neighborhood into a war with Karen. But if he didn't take action, she would keep getting away with it. And he couldn't let that happen. He had already begun gathering support. It wasn't long before he had a few allies, neighbors who had grown tired of Karen's grip on the community. They were ready to listen. They were ready to stand up. One by one, Jake began talking to his neighbors, telling them about Karen's tactics, the unreasonable complaints, and her attempts to control every little thing in the neighborhood. At first, they were hesitant to get involved, not wanting to stir up any trouble. But as Jake explained how Karen had tried to manipulate him with false complaints and how her actions had made life difficult for others, their attitudes began to shift. Slowly but surely, Jake was building a coalition. He wasn't forcing anyone to take his side, but he was giving them the facts. And the more they heard, the more they realized they weren't alone. Karen's tactics had alienated more people than she had realized. The realization was like a ripple effect. It spread throughout the neighborhood, one conversation at a time. People started talking, and Karen's influence began to crack. She hadn't been prepared for this kind of resistance. As Jake saw more and more neighbors on his side, his confidence grew. He wasn't just a guy mowing his lawn or putting out his trash. He was a man standing up for what was right. He wasn't going to let Karen's manipulative ways continue. She had made her move, but now it was his turn. The neighborhood was starting to rally around Jake. And that meant Karen's influence was slipping. He knew it was only a matter of time before she tried to escalate things. The power she had wielded for so long was beginning to fade. But Jake knew Karen wouldn't back down. She wasn't the type to admit defeat. The next confrontation was coming, and Jake was ready for it. He wasn't going to let her tear down everything he had worked for. She had spent too much time making people afraid of her, using her position in the HOA to control them, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. That night, Jake sat down to draft another email, this one to the HOA. He wasn't going to let them be swayed by Karen's complaints. He wasn't going to let her manipulate them into doing her bidding. This email would tell them exactly what had been happening in the neighborhood. It would lay out the truth. He wasn't going to back down from this fight, not when so many people were now standing with him. As he typed, Jake could feel the weight of the words. This wasn't just about a lawnmower or trash bins anymore. This was about standing up to someone who had been allowed to control others for far too long. And he wasn't going to let it happen any longer. He hit send, and then leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. The battle wasn't over, but the first real step had been taken. Karen had picked a fight with the wrong person, and now, Jake was going to make sure she realized it. He wasn't just protecting his property anymore. He was fighting for the truth. And truth, as Jake knew, had a way of always coming to light. The next few days felt like a game of cat and mouse. Jake had sent the email to the HOA, and now he was waiting. He knew Karen would try to fight back. She always did. But this time, things were different. He wasn't going to sit back and let her manipulate the situation any longer. He was ready for whatever came next. As he walked through the neighborhood, he could feel the change in the air. The conversations were quieter now, the usual small talk replaced by hushed whispers. Neighbors who had always avoided each other were now nodding in agreement, exchanging knowing glances. The tide was turning, and Jake could feel it. He had started a chain reaction, and it was beginning to gain momentum. But even with all the support he was gathering, Jake knew Karen wasn't going to back down easily. She had too much pride, too much control over the HOA and the neighborhood, and she wasn't going to let him make her look weak. That evening, Jake received a call from his lawyer. "Jake, Karen's lawyer reached out to us today," the lawyer said, his voice serious. "She's threatening a lawsuit over the trash complaints, claiming you're trying to harass her. She's not letting this go." Jake could hear the frustration in his lawyer's voice. He knew that Karen wasn't going to make things easy. She was the type to escalate things when she didn't get her way. But Jake wasn't about to back down. "I'm not worried," Jake replied, his tone calm but firm. "I've got everything documented. I've done nothing wrong. She's just angry because she's losing control." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then his lawyer spoke again, quieter this time. "I know, Jake, but we have to be careful. Karen has a lot of influence, and she knows how to push people's buttons. If she keeps this up, she could make things difficult for you, even if she's in the wrong." Jake gritted his teeth. He hated the idea of being controlled by someone like Karen. She had already used her influence to make his life difficult enough. "I'll handle it," Jake said, his voice steady. "But I'm not going to let her get away with this. If she wants a fight, she's going to get one." The lawyer sighed. "Just be careful. We'll be ready for whatever comes next, but don't underestimate her." Jake hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, his hands clenched into fists. Karen had underestimated him before, and she would do it again. But this time, it was different. He wasn't going to let her control him. Not anymore. He had the support of the neighborhood now. People were starting to speak out against Karen's behavior, and that made all the difference. Jake spent the next few days gathering more information. He visited neighbors, talked to them about what Karen had been doing, and made sure he had witnesses who could back up his claims. He wasn't about to let her get away with manipulating the HOA and making life miserable for everyone around her. Slowly but surely, Jake was building a case. He wasn't just preparing for a legal battle. He was preparing to take Karen down. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for the whole neighborhood. He couldn't let Karen continue to terrorize people with her petty complaints and rules. It wasn't just about the trash cans or the lawn mowing anymore. It was about making sure that no one had to live in fear of someone like her. The next HOA meeting was fast approaching, and Jake knew that Karen would be there, ready to defend herself, ready to fight. But this time, it wouldn't be just her. This time, Jake had allies. This time, people were going to stand up to her. As the day of the meeting arrived, Jake felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had prepared for this. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't afraid anymore. He wasn't afraid of Karen or the HOA or the fight ahead. He was ready. He arrived at the meeting early, his heart pounding in his chest, but his mind sharp and focused. As he sat down, he noticed Karen already sitting at the front, her usual smug expression plastered on her face. She glanced at Jake and then quickly looked away, clearly still seething. She hadn't expected him to fight back, but here he was. "I'm not going to back down," Jake muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. As the meeting began, Jake listened carefully as Karen started her usual tirade, complaining about everything from the trash pickup times to the way people parked in their driveways. She even had the audacity to bring up Jake's mowing schedule again, trying to make him the villain. But this time, the mood was different. The board members didn't nod in agreement like they always had. Instead, they looked uneasy, as if they were starting to see the cracks in Karen's perfect image. Then, when it was Jake's turn to speak, he stood up calmly, collected his notes, and looked around the room. He knew this was his moment. He wasn't just defending himself. He was standing up for everyone who had been pushed around by Karen and her petty rules. "I've been living in this neighborhood for years," Jake began, his voice steady. "And I've never had a problem with the HOA until now. Karen has made my life a living hell for no reason other than because she thinks she has the power to do so. I've followed every rule, I've paid my dues, and I've respected the community. But Karen has used her position to control people, to manipulate the HOA, and to make life difficult for anyone who disagrees with her. It's time that stops." Jake paused, letting his words sink in. He could see some of the board members nodding, their expressions thoughtful. He knew he was getting through to them. "I'm not here to make trouble," he continued. "I just want to live my life in peace. But if Karen keeps using her position to bully people and cause unnecessary problems, I'm not going to stay silent anymore." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of Jake's words hanging in the air. Then, one of the board members, a woman named Linda, spoke up. "I think it's time we take a closer look at how the HOA is being run," she said, her voice firm. "This isn't about one person. This is about the community. And if one person is causing trouble for the entire neighborhood, it needs to be addressed." The shift in the room was palpable. Jake had done it. He had taken the first step in exposing Karen for what she was. And as the meeting went on, Karen's grip on the HOA began to slip. By the end of the night, Jake knew this battle wasn't over, but he was one step closer to winning. Jake knew that the moment he stepped into the HOA meeting, everything would change. The support he had gained over the past few weeks had started to shift the dynamics in his favor, but Karen wasn't going to give up without a fight. She had too much pride, and her need for control was too strong. But Jake was ready. He had made his case, gathered his evidence, and built a network of allies who were ready to speak out. The board members had seen the cracks in Karen's facade, but it wasn't enough to defeat her just yet. This was the final battle, and Jake wasn't about to lose as the meeting began. The atmosphere felt different. Karen was still sitting at the front, her eyes scanning the room as if she was preparing for another one of her usual attacks. But today, she wasn't the only one with power. Jake could feel the eyes of the board members on him, and for the first time, he wasn't intimidated. He stood up when it was his turn to speak, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "I'm here today because I'm tired of living in fear of someone who thinks they can control every aspect of my life," he started, his voice echoing through the room. "Karen, as the HOA president, has used her position to intimidate people, to make arbitrary rules, and to bully anyone who disagrees with her. It's not just about trash days or mowing my lawn. It's about respect, and it's about fairness. And I'm not going to stand by and let her continue this abuse." Jake could see Karen's jaw tighten as he spoke. She tried to hide it, but there was no mistaking the anger in her eyes. She had underestimated him, and now, she was starting to realize she had lost control of the situation. He continued, "I've followed every rule. I've paid my dues. And I've done everything asked of me. But Karen has used her power to make my life miserable, to control the people around her, and to push them into silence. I won't be silent anymore. The community deserves better." There was a moment of silence in the room as the board members processed his words. Jake could feel their skepticism turning into understanding. They had seen Karen's behavior firsthand, but now they were hearing it from someone else. Someone who wasn't afraid to speak up. As the meeting went on, Jake's allies began to speak out as well, one by one. His neighbors who had supported him, the ones who had seen the unfairness, who had lived through Karen's manipulation, began to voice their concerns. They shared their experiences, their frustrations with Karen's constant overreach. One by one, the board members began to nod in agreement, and Karen's confident demeanor began to crack. She tried to interrupt several times, but her voice trembled with anger. "This is nonsense," Karen shouted, standing up from her chair. "These people are just trying to smear me. They are making up lies." Jake calmly stood his ground. "No, Karen. These aren't lies. These are the actions you've taken. And it's time for everyone to see it for what it is." Karen's face turned red with fury, and she opened her mouth to argue, but the board members weren't listening anymore. Linda, the board member who had first spoken up for Jake, raised her hand to stop Karen. "Enough, Karen," she said, her voice firm. "This isn't about your feelings. This is about the integrity of the HOA. And frankly, your actions have raised serious concerns among the community." Karen's eyes widened in disbelief. She had always controlled the HOA, always made everyone bend to her will, but now the tide was turning. She was losing her grip. The board members began to discuss the issue in hushed tones, and Jake could see the shift in their attitudes. Karen was no longer the voice of authority. She was being scrutinized, questioned, and for the first time, she was the one on the defensive. The discussions lasted for what felt like hours, but eventually, the board made their decision. Linda stood up and addressed the room. "We've heard from everyone, and it's clear that there are serious concerns about how things have been handled under your leadership. Karen," she said, her voice steady. "We are suspending your position as HOA president, effective immediately." Jake felt a surge of satisfaction, but he didn't show it. This was a victory, but it wasn't just about Karen losing her position. It was about proving that no one was above the rules, not even her. "You're making a mistake," Karen hissed, her voice venomous. "You'll regret this, all of you." But the board members weren't fazed. They had made their decision, and the room was already moving on without her. As Karen stormed out of the room, her face twisted with rage, Jake finally allowed himself a small smile. The battle was over, and he had won. But this wasn't just about Karen losing her position. It was about the whole neighborhood standing together, about proving that no one, no matter how much power they thought they had, could make others feel small. As the meeting adjourned, Jake's neighbors gathered around him, clapping him on the back and congratulating him. They were finally free from Karen's control, and it felt like a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Jake's phone buzzed, and he saw a message from Mike. "We did it, man. Karen's gone. Thanks for standing up for all of us." Jake smiled, feeling the warmth of victory. It wasn't just about one man fighting back against an oppressive HOA president. It was about a community coming together, standing up for what was right, and making sure they all had a voice. And for the first time in a long time, Jake felt like he could finally breathe. Karen was gone, and the neighborhood was free.